We can go on and get started. Again, we are recording tonight's class, so hello to those of you who are watching this later. I was going to bring some water out and just realized that I forgot to. So if you would like any water or anything, there are bathrooms outside in the hall and water fountains and a sink and cups back there. I have little handouts on your chairs, not super necessary. If you're like me, I like to take notes and such. I can get you a pen too. Does anybody want a pen? No? Okay, cool. Well, these Monday night classes are a part of our adult enrichment or adult education ministry, but religious education is about way more than what happens in here. I think it's a holistic thing, mind, body, and spirit. So to get started, why don't we take a second and just kind of get more centered to this room, to this space. Mondays are Mondays, and there's always something on Mondays we'd like to let go. So let's take a moment in silence, and then I'll invite you just to think of a word for yourself for how you're feeling right now. It could be about your mind, about your body, about your spirit, about the world. But let's take a minute in silence and maybe put a word to how we're feeling right now, and then we'll dive in. Well, my word is curious, because I'm curious what's going to come out of these conversations tonight in the next 2 weeks. Super excited for this 3-part series, Whole New World, to invite some wonderful friends. I'm being selfish, are my friends, and guests like Letiah, who do ministry here in Kansas City and beyond, to come and share about new ways in which they're embodying God's wholeness in our changing world. So much, we're sick of hearing this. So much has changed over the past 3 years. The pandemic, political atmospheres, everything in between. Like, we knew before that the only constant was change, but we know that now. But one thing that has not changed is that God is inviting us into wholeness in every moment. Even through that change, God invites us, I think, into new and deeper experiences of wholeness in God's presence. So this class and the next 2 weeks are inviting us to think about what new ways we might embody God's wholeness as individuals and as a church community. And this is particularly important to who we are at Country Club, I think. Beyond the broader changes in the world, we are changing as a congregation. We just celebrated our centennial over the past few years, an elongated celebration because of the pandemic. And as we are all aware here in this building, the building is changing. As I think it was just last week we started on construction. So I've been excited to invite us into this conversation because now more than ever is a critical opportunity for us to think, what is changing and how can we change with God through this process? But beyond us, just as an individual church too, as disciples of Christ, our denomination slogan is that we are a movement for wholeness in the fragmented world. So that's this Whole New World title. It has nothing to do with Aladdin. I mean, if you want to perform, you have the whole night. So, but it's everything to do with what it means for us to find wholeness in this new and changing world. Change is not new, but it feels new over the past few years. But wholeness has become one of the kind of the calls of who we are as disciples. Really, our DNA has become naming that we are a movement for wholeness in the fragmented world. Going to geek out about disciples' history for a minute. Sharon Watkins was our previous general minister and president. Up until 2017, she served, and in her tenure as GMP of our denomination, she ushered along this process as us becoming known as a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. She even wrote a book, because that's what good general ministers and presidents do, about wholeness. And I wanted to offer this. Wholeness is like one of my favorite words, but it is such a buzzword among like certain communities. I think other people have no idea what it means. So as we think about a whole new world and how God might be inviting us into wholeness, I want to offer this. This is what Sharon Watkins says about wholeness. She says that wholeness begins as persons enfolded into God's welcome learn to love God back by loving neighbors near and far. So wholeness is not just this emotional state in which we feel all good. It's about knowing that we are loved by God and sharing that love with others. She continues and says, and yet the cozy communities that resulted from loving God and neighbor do not cue the final credits in the story. The happy ending has not quite arrived. God seems to have even a larger purpose in view. Not just churches renewed, not just neighborhoods renewed, rather a world renewed. So read this book if you're curious. We might have a copy of it down in the well. But she's talking here about how the message we gather around as a church, that God's love is infinite and eternal and for all people, does not just renew us into this inner sense of wholeness, but rather calls us to look at the entire world and all of its fragments and try to work with God to make things whole, to work towards healing, newness, all of these good things, peace, justice, and love, to make the world more whole. The other thing that's kind of providing context for this conversation over the next few weeks. From the beginning, Christianity has been about doing things in new ways. It is really intimidating, I think, to be Christian in the contemporary landscape, not because there's persecution against us, but because religion is becoming more and more kind of irrelevant to modern culture for good reasons and bad reasons and everything in between. But the good news is that Christianity was born out of a crisis politically and spiritually, and has always been about finding new ways to experience God in the changing world. So the last thing I'm gonna mention this every week at the beginning, just to kind of give our brains context for the conversations we have with our wonderful guests. But there's a certain parable that kind of inspired me when I was thinking of this class from the get-go. And it comes, at least one version, from Luke 5. And it says this: Jesus told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and sews it on a new garment. Otherwise, not only will one tear away from the new garment, but the piece from the new garment will not match the old garment. Similarly, no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins and will spill out, and the skins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new wine, but says the old is good. And so, how many of y'all have heard this parable of the wineskins? It's kind of a niche one. It's one of those more esoteric ones, and it's one of my favorites. This idea that God is doing something new in the world, and we can't go back to old forms of containing what God was doing. New wine needs new wineskin. So I think for us as Christians, especially for those of us a part of this 100-year-old church, carrying this momentum of God, doing an ever-evolving thing in the world, bringing people into love and justice and wholeness, we must be careful to take this flow that we're a part of, not just do old things because they're familiar, but to find new ways of doing things so that we can contain the new ways in which God wants to bring wholeness into the world. So as part of this movement for wholeness in a fragmented world, which includes, I think, anybody who's trying to build justice and peace in this world, and especially we at Country Club, think about how the world has changed and we're called to doing new things. I think Letiah is going to give us some insight tonight, and our other guests in upcoming weeks will give us some more insight about what new wineskins we need for this new wine. So go back and read that parable, sit with it. It's one of my favorites. But we're not talking about literal wine tonight, even though I think Mitch has some for spaghetti dinner he's making at home right now afterwards. So I'm going to get some new wine at home. But in a spiritual, metaphorical sense, God is calling us to something new. And so what does that look like inside and out? So I'm super excited to start with my friend and colleague, Reverend Dr. Letiah Fraser, who runs the Open Table. The Open Table is a community that meets every second and fourth Sunday right down the street at Second Presbyterian Church. And they gather for dinner, music, and conversation, seeking to create space for hospitality, conversation, peace, and reconciliation, with theology rooted in both contemplation and liberation. Spirituality and justice go hand in hand, and that's what the Open Table is about. The Open Table is close to us at Country Club, not just geographically, they're like literally a mile away, but also spiritually. We long have talked about what it means for us to gather around communion each week. And when Mike's book Table Talk was released, I know a lot of us at the church were talking about the Open Table as a community that does what we do at Country Club, just in a different format. And we have plenty of crossover, folk like Hannah, Chi. There's a number of other Country Club folk who also hang out with the Open Table table and vice versa. All the anti-racism trainings that we did in 2020 were led by the Open Table anti-racism cohort. We are close friends for many reasons. So I'm super excited, as the Open Table has been a huge inspiration for me in discovering what new ways God is calling us to embody wholeness in the world, but especially to have Letiah here, who not only is she doing the new work of God's wholeness through the Open Table, but even more broadly, her work as a public theologian around disabled theology and so much more has created a huge inspiration for the world. Sojourners magazine named her one of the 20 women changing the face of the church this past year. And credentials aside, she's one of the most amazing people. So let's give Letiah a round of applause, and then we'll invite her to first share some stories about how she's doing newness, and then we'll have some time for question and answer.
Yeah.
So Letiah,
I'm hoping that this will be more of a discussion, conversation, but I know that Tyler came and told us a word that he was feeling, and I'm curious to know what else is in the room. So if I were to say I'm going to do 2 words, even though I'm asking for 1 word, but I break rules, it's fine. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed, just a lot of things going on in life, juggling so many things, but also some gratitude for just being in this space tonight. So if we can start over here with a name and your 1 word. How are you showing up in this space today?
Welcome, and the 1 word is peace.
Okay.
I'm Hannah Finley, and I'm going to break the rules too. I'm feeling grateful, and one of the things I'm feeling grateful for is my resilience, your resilience, the resilience of so many.
Mm-hmm.
Marita Smith. I think my word was tired.
All right, and that's welcome here too. It's Monday, right? So, yeah.
I'm just curious.
Okay.
I'm John Bartlett. Go with his word, curious.
Okay.
Thank you. Shouldn't have stolen it.
And I'm Julia Bartlett, and I would say retuning.
I'm curious about that word, but yeah, that's good. Yeah, it is a good word. I also want to bring into space tonight Ralph Fiore, so the 16-year-old who was shot in North Kansas City. We know that there's a lot wrapped into that, but that racism and white supremacy culture is wrapped in it all, right? It's not just in cities and states and other places, but right here. We want to just hold him and the family in our thoughts and prayers, but not in a way that's like, I'm just going to say we're thinking and praying, but that it might move us to some sort of action, especially since it's right here in our backyard. All right, I thought that we would start with a short video that we put together for our Giving Tuesday. And the question was simply, why do you come to the Open Table?
I enjoy coming to Open Table because I have friends here. It's good to always see friendly faces and meet new ones.
It's a great place to connect with other people in my community, eat together.
It is super welcoming, and I know that I've made a lot of good friends here.
It is a safe space for people of all walks of life to come.
I really appreciate the different perspectives from all the presenters that come in.
I love the way we expand our minds around all things spiritual.
Being able to dialogue in what feels like a really safe community.
It's just a great place where I can be me, and I feel like other people can be honest and open.
Our church has a wide variety of people who come, but not everyone who comes looks like me, talks like me.
I really love us. I love that we have committed to being with one another and learning with one another and growing with one another, even when that sometimes can be hard.
We discuss hard things, but it's in a fun environment to listen as well. You don't have to talk if you don't want to.
We can all just learn together and share life together.
I really feel like we live out the church's teaching, reaching out to other people and just remembering that there's a shared humanity.
Trying with all of our hearts and all of our minds and all of our spirits to commune the way Jesus did.
All right, it's not Giving Tuesday, but feel free. Okay, there's anything else? Anything that stuck out in this short video? Okay. Definitely do a lot of listening. Anything else?
The juxtaposition of diversity and belonging, it's cool to see.
Yeah. So, 2020, that magical year that we will never forget, was the first year that I began the residency with the 1001 New Worshiping Communities. So I had only known the Open Table during pandemic times. And I was a resident for 2 years, and then this past July, I became the pastor of the Open Table. So reemerging from kind of the pandemic, or at least the pandemic where we were all shut down, because the pandemic still exists. But, and realizing that as a community of faith and justice, that once was a space that had 80 to 100 people, and were mobilizing around a lot of the racial uprisings, and then coming back and realizing that our whole landscape is different, and especially the church, that folks got used to not feeling the need to be in a physical space. And so we began to ask the question, and we're still asking the question. We're doing a whole series on it now. And I should say I have no answers. I'm just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall in some ways, and trying to see what sticks, right? So church is always an experiment of the Spirit, right? You listen to what the Spirit might be saying, and you try it. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, but you learn things. So the series that we're in right now is simply why, because as Tyler alluded to, people are like, why even do religion? Why is this important? So we're asking those questions. Why faith at all? Why church? And what is church? Why read the Bible? Why is that important? And in what ways can we read the Bible, like not throw it out, because there have been impressive ways that the Bible has been read, but how do we read it in a way that is liberatory and that motivates us to move and work for justice in the world? And then we have, and it's always been true of the DNA of the Open Table, that we have people who grew up in the church and then who didn't, like a whole spectrum of folks. Figuring out why is it that we're meeting together. And the themes are, we listen well to each other around the table. That not one person holds all the knowledge, that we have a variety of speakers that come, but also we've slowed that down even a little bit to say, we'll have a speaker and then we'll talk amongst ourselves to say, okay, we heard all this stuff in our head. How do we apply it in our hearts and in our bodies and in the world? Yeah, I have notes, so I'm gonna make sure I don't keep rambling. Hold on. And then we've done really well to make connections with local folks and other churches too. So we're made connections with Metropolitan Missionary Baptist Church, which is a historically Black church, to say if we're gonna do, and there are many ways to come at this work of anti-racism, but what we've recently started is, because I know and am making connections with Metropolitan Missionary Baptist Church, I said, hey, why don't we come together and really do some inner work that will produce some outward work around anti-racism. So mostly, while there's sprinkles of everybody at the Open Table, I would say that it's a predominantly white denomination, group of people who who are in this like deconstructing, which has also become a buzzword too, because I think that we should always be deconstructing, but we should always also be reconstructing something. So we've come together, and this is we just did our second meeting this past Sunday, and we're switching spaces. So 1 week we'll meet at Metropolitan Missionary Baptist Church, and then the next month we'll meet at Second Pres, and having discussions around anti-racism and white supremacy culture, and having caucus groups where the white folks get to kind of work on the stuff that they need to unlearn, relearn, and learn again. And the BIPOC folks get to do the same work, so that when we go out into the world, we are doing hopefully less harm to each other and to those that we meet. Communion for us is not the traditional communion that you see in a church, but we share a meal together around tables, and we have what we call table anchors that either have general questions that as a way to check in with one another, or questions that will be related to whatever the speaker will be talking about, so that there's conversation happening beyond even the speaker. I think for us, some of the challenges is we don't have those 80 people anymore, but the gift of that is that the folks that are there are committed and consistent. I think that sometimes part of the history of the open table is that folks would come depending on the series, and you'd still have your committed core of folks, whereas now there's a definite committed core, and I say, like, why do you keep coming is always the question, and it's always about relationship, being able to ask the questions that they were not able to ask in other religious spaces, to look at the Bible and church and all this stuff in different ways, and to be politically active. So I think those are the things that keep people coming back to the open table. And I think that the church in this whole new world will be groups of people who are more mystic than they are folks that come to a thing on Sunday. So how do we embody these anti-racist principles and qualities in our everyday life and do spiritual practices that aren't just centered on being in the same place on a Sunday? Okay, I said a lot. Any questions? And then I'll keep going.
I think that, what kind of speakers, what kind of subjects do the speakers talk about?
Yeah, so right now we're doing about why the Bible, why church, why all that. So we began with a panel of folks that are pastors and those who are not, those who have no faith and those who are, so a whole thing, kind of trying to represent most of everybody that would be there and having good conversation. We just did one on why faith, and then we're going to do one this Sunday on why the Bible, like why even read this book. And so the speakers are pastors, they're organizers, they're folks from our leadership team, so not just folks that have a theological background, but an activist background, someone who's on the journey too, trying to figure out things, have questions. And so that's like the presenter will present whatever they're presenting. And then there's conversation, there's embodied practice. So what traditionally might be considered like prayers of the people if we were like in a traditional church, what we do is joys and sorrows. So folks will get up and say, my joy for this week has been like I'm 5 years sober, and we will hold that, or whatever the sorrow is. And there's a variety of social economic status present too. So like you can hold like someone who is houseless and someone who, is in a higher economic bracket together and having dinner together and sharing sorrows and joys together. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, so I think most times we have anywhere between 30 to 40 folks, and sometimes you don't see the same people all the time. Like you have the committed core, and then, but I think that's the trend of the church right now. I think at one point they were saying if someone came like 1.5 times to their spiritual community, they considered themselves as part of it, right? So no longer are people coming every Sunday, and we don't even meet every Sunday, but no longer are people coming even the second and fourth Sunday all the time. And we, on the third Sunday, that is when we do our anti-racism racial caucus cohorts. So, yeah. That's,
It's like 1.5 times a month.
yeah.
Huh, yeah.
Uh-huh. So, and they're like, this is my spiritual community.
Speak of the committed core, committed to what?
To being in community together. So those are the folks who you will see every second and fourth Sunday. Those are the folks that meet with each other outside of, like, they just live life, right? Regardless of whether I'm there or leadership team folks are there.
Hard time getting around the structure or something like that.
Okay, tell me more.
To what end do you do this?
It's still a spiritual community, right? And it's, but while my core is I believe in God and Jesus as the person that I follow. That's not, I guess it's picking up and trying to navigate where people are on their journey. So to be a guide, to be willing to have conversation and hard conversations and not have this prescribed end of like, I want you to be here and believe this and do that, but to journey with folks where they are. Yeah.
It's almost like the house church that we had in Jesus' time.
It feels very much like that because we make the meals together, we clean up together, we joke in between together. Share the joys and the sorrows. Other than it being in a church, like we meet in a traditional building, it's not very church. It could very well be in someone's house. Yeah.
I think one thing I love about my participation is, even though it meets in a building that looks a lot like this, I mean, David's my friend. There's a houseless man who comes, it's a meal from him, but we love on him and he loves on us.
Yeah.
I get a text from him every so often, I'm doing well, Hannah, how are you? And I wouldn't have known David otherwise. And I think people who are non-conforming gender, or how would I say that, not traditional, I know the word, like me, cisgender, hetero cisgender, or whatever. Those folks are just welcomed and comfortable there. And I just think you can't everywhere walk into someone where no matter whoever walks in, it's like, welcome.
Yeah. And deep connections, right? And it depends on who it is. Like, we don't force it, but like, I've just loved that there has been stuff that happens outside of our times, and we also started because we felt the need coming out of the main point of the pandemic. Folks are like, we want to be together. So different folks will host. We call them dinners for 6, like every quarter. And it's 6 people-ish, sometimes a little bit more. And we're just talking about people's lives. Normal conversation that you would have with anybody. And those are some really good times where you like hear about people's history, hear about people's joys, hear about people's spiritual struggles, and yet this deep connection to still want to be a part of a spiritual community.
How does this differ from what goes on in, say, the St. Stephen's Baptist Church, for example?
I don't know what goes, but I would say that there's not a sermon in the traditional sense. There's not a communion in the sense. There's not a you must ascribe to these doctrines, that's the word. I'm like, I went to seminary, I promise. These doctrines. But we are committed to living life together. We are committed to figuring out ways that we can be and do justice. We are committed to being in community, in the communities we live in, but with people who look, think, vote every other way are different than us.
So for some people, this is like a supplement to how they experience religion, and for some people, this is how they're experiencing their spirituality.
Yeah, and we have both of those because we have some folks that come here on Sunday mornings and then come there Sunday evening, right? And then there are some who, or at least right now on their spiritual journey, would say that like the Open Table is their spiritual home and that they would not go to a traditional church.
Or I think of one of my best friends, Maddie, who some of y'all know, was a resident along with Letiah a couple years ago. And I met Maddie, and she was a poet and a barista who had more religious trauma than religious longing, but then found herself connected with the Open Table and became in leadership, and it was really meaningful to be in ministry together.
I mean, what I'm getting is that in today's world, maybe we need to find all these like branches out because the world is hungry for them. It's spiritualness. But this structure doesn't feed everybody.
Right.
So you have to. So Open Table is one example of how we need to retrain our brains to think about how we embrace everything. So for me, right, small town, farm girl, like church Sunday, that's how you do your community, that's just what it is. Like everybody grew up in the church, everybody grew up in this environment, everybody knew the hymns, everybody knew the prayers, everybody knew like that is in part for me religion, is there's a ritualness to it. But that's not the world. That's actually not even the world for my kids, and I've raised them in this church, and I am a Sunday school teacher, so when I can, I drag them out of bed. I mean, one's 17 now, one's 21. I can't drag a 21-year-old. I can really drag a 17-year-old out of bed. But there was, like, that's how I knew how to raise my kids, to be spiritual, because there was this routine. But I think what I'm hearing you say is that's not true, and this is what I know, too, like, that's not true in the world.
And yet I believe that there is a spiritual hunger, right? So it's tapping into that, knowing that God is bigger than any of our structures that we grew up in. I mean, I grew up in holiness Pentecostal churches. So like, yes, trust. Working on my own trauma, okay? But because of that, I can recognize that in a lot of the people that come and find space at the Open Table, right? Like, and I think that's the challenge for us. I was talking to one of my mentors. I'm like, oh, I came from a very evangelical background. And how do you like let people know about the Open Table and the community and all that stuff and not be evangelical about it? I don't know how to do that. He says, I'm allergic to all things evangelical. I was like, maybe. And yet, we still want people to know about the community that we're forming together. And I think the future of the church will look like smaller house church models where you actually do life together. And that part of what we do will be like more overtly spiritual, but most of it will not be. It's just like living life. Yeah.
Elaborate on that a little bit. I don't mean to
No, you're good. Go ahead.
be repetitive about this. I'm interested. But when you say you have a reaction against things evangelically, explain what you're reacting against and what bothers you.
Yeah, so I think for me, it's this, and a lot of folks that have the background that come to the Open Table, this like we got to tell people about Jesus, or they're going to go to hell, or we're going to go to hell. This, we've got to believe these certain statements that you can't question, the Bible. You can't question prayer. You can't question God. You can't question, right? Yeah, I would say those are the main things that I react to, and a lot of the folks who come to the open table would.
So you're reacting against the dogmatism that
Right. Yeah. Other thoughts?
It's interesting what you said though, because again, we do have kids that are 21 and 17. Like the 21-year-old, I watch all of his friends. They are drawn to that dynamic, like in your face, everything. But what they're drawn to is the attention and the showmanship and the, and you're caught up in something, and it's a feeling, and so it's interesting because on the one hand, I don't think they would walk into we used to call it a house church, and at the same time, but I think that's what they really need.
Mm-hmm.
They're drawn into this big thing, which
But I
to say
wonder-
I love too. I mean, I grew up performing. I love that, right? Like I feel that, and I wish I had more of that. So I get it. I get why, because it turns you on, right? But what they need is the substance of this. And so where I struggle with what you're saying is like, maybe it's because I'm watching my kids. Boy, God, you gotta like let go. Like, okay, it's gonna be their mistake to make, but we're not mistake, but whatever. But how do we find the mix between those two? Because I don't think a house church is going to draw in that younger generation. I think they're gonna always be over here. And so for me, it's like, how do you bring this discussion to what I love?
So I think it's the mix of, and I haven't figured out what the right ingredient is, but it's the mix of action and contemplation, so that we do stuff out in the world that is justice oriented and forming ourselves to be anti-racist, and contemplation, the thing, prayer, whatever that is for folks, and reading scripture and all those things. So those, you got to balance those in some way, and I think we're still trying to figure that out too. Like, we don't have the formula, but once I get it, I'll patent it for everybody.
I like that, the showmanship that may not be in a sanctuary, but out on the street.
Yeah.
Is what a lot of young people are drawn to.
Which is the works of action and social justice, right? So what does it look like? Because I've been in those spaces too, where I'm with all types of people and we sing a justice song, and I feel like that's church to me. And nobody like read a scripture verse or anything like that. And yet I feel like that's where Jesus would be, right? Among those who are being oppressed. And I would say that perhaps that's where the younger generation would be, like seeing that there's action and something happening that would actually be good for the world, feeding the hungry. And yet, again, we need both action and contemplation, because if we do all this flashy stuff but have no substance, then when something challenging happens, we have nothing to fall back on. Yeah. Other thoughts, I gotta clean my glasses so I can see you. Okay.
I have a few questions that I'm planning to ask each of our guests this week.
Do it.
So if you're ready for those.
Do it.
So I have like a shorter version on this slideshow because it kind of, yeah. But thinking within this class is whole new world. We're in a new world. Let's say that the old world was pre-pandemic, who knows? But thinking about like the new wineskins, new wine, new world versus the old world. My three questions, and we can do one, two, and then the other, but they're all related. But first, what is something that you hope to see people of faith, both as individuals and communities, hold on to from the past world? Because we're not just, like you said, we're not just trying to deconstruct everything, but it's a mutual process. What's one thing you hope we hold on to from the old world? What's one thing you hope we let go of? And then what's one thing you hope we create in this new world?
Okay.
So, three directions there.
Things we hold on to. I think a sense of the very real presence of God in the world. Like, God is for real. So I think we hold on to that. I think we, and each community has to do this for themselves, hold on to the traditions that are helpful. Tradition in itself is not bad. And I think the folks that I'm around a lot, I read or use the Book of Common Prayer, and those prayers have been written many, many years ago. And yet, because I know people have prayed those prayers for so long, both those living and those who are ancestors now, so finding those things that have lasted the test of time, I think let's hold on to that.
What are some ways in which the open table kind of does some of the, I mean, I know because I've been there, but like some of the more ancient traditions that do weave their way into?
Yeah, so we do a variety of prayers when we open or close from many different traditions and not just Christian traditions. We do Tizay services where we are challenged to sit, to think, to meditate, to be together. Trying to think of like old or traditional things that we do. Sharing a meal I think is very traditional, right? That even communion in the time of Jesus was more of a meal than a cracker and juice or wine, depending on where you are. And that even asking questions. So throughout Scripture, especially in what Jesus says, he often throws a question back at folks when they're challenging. So I think we do that well. Like, I don't know. What do you think? And there are things that I know, but I don't want you to say, I don't want to say, this is what I know, so believe it. But I want folks to come to their own understanding of that. Because I believe God is real and active. And so if I believe that, then God can speak to you in the same way God can speak to me. What was the other question?
So if that's what we hold on to, what's one thing you hope we let go of?
So I would say I hope that we have a bigger and better imagination than we've had as a church altogether, right? The church has to look this way for it to be church. I think that and it's hard because I grew up in the church too, so even trying to figure out ways to not do it in the ways that I feel comfortable with. So I have a bigger imagination of what it means to be Christians, what it means to be people of faith in this world. And that we imagine that together, that dismantle systems of white supremacy and all the isms. So yes, I hope that we imagine. And then the third one.
It's one thing you hope we create as people, individuals and / or communities of faith.
I hope that we create places that aren't afraid to question. I hope that we create places that aren't afraid to dismantle oppression, that aren't worried about if we do this, we might lose these people. If we do that, we might lose this money. Because in the beginning, Jesus was more of a movement leader than like an institutional structure. Like, he gathered 12 and then more to agitate the system that was in place. So I hope we become agitators. Yeah. Other thoughts on that or other questions?
A couple others. What's my first one? I'm curious about you more personally. Like, think about your ministry, think about everything else, but what's like over the past 3 years, maybe since you came on to Open Table, like in the pandemic and everything's changed, what's like one thing that gives you hope in your own faith journey? We do our faith journey individually, I think. It's not isolated.
Right.
But what's one way, like thinking as an individual, what's been one of the most grounding things for you spiritually in this new world?
Grounding things for me. I think particularly because of the pandemic, I have reached out to folks that I've never met actually in person, but have prayed together with them on Zoom and other things like that. And I think that's what gives me hope, that even if folks can't walk into a space that's a church or a religious space, that they can connect virtually with one another. So I love that, like, the geography that would divide us or separate us just because we're not in the same space doesn't really do that now. Yeah.
And my last is, what's like one word of advice you'd give for a 100-year-old church who's, I think we have so much DNA in common with you at the Open Table. Like, we are a questions church, not an answers church. Like, so many of us in this room and in this congregation are here because we're sick of the dogma too. Like, someone told me on my interview here, I love this church because I don't feel like I have to believe that Jesus was literally God every Sunday. And I was like, you're not supposed to tell the pastor that, but I'm really glad you did, because same. So we're doing this work together, just totally different histories. What's like one tip, trick, advice? Word
I
of
would
encouragement
say
your
experiment, because everything's different, right? We're in a whole new world. And don't be afraid that because Christianity is swiftly on the decline, don't be afraid that if the structures as they are don't exist in the next 10 years, that God is still not at work, right? That it might look different, but that it's okay. Like, we don't have to institutionalize whatever our religious beliefs are, which can be a scary thing.
Well, what about y'all? Any other questions or curiosities about the Open Table? I'll share.
Where do you meet anyway?
We meet out of Second Presbyterian Church. Yeah.
That's another point of overlap. Matt Thompson, our music director, his wife Cherie, who plays organ here a lot, is the organist at Second Presbyterian now. So, small world. I'm reminded too. I've taught the Open Table twice, I think, and like did a class on Mary Magdalene, a class on like queer theory as liberation theology. So those were cool access points, like to geek out about some things.
And did you do the saint? Was yours Mary? Okay, yeah.
Or no, my saint was not even Mary Magdalene.
No.
It was Jane Shaver,
Yeah.
who's a biblical scholar who's worked a lot around Mary Magdalene. And it was cool to do that online. But I also came on an Advent thing, or like the Christmas Eve service, more or less. It was a few days before Christmas Eve. And that was a cool moment to see this ancient tradition being celebrated in such a different way. That was life-giving.
Yeah, we lit the candles, but talked about Jesus as liberator, as someone whose parents were refugees, and who experienced houselessness, and so this very human nature of Jesus, and that not that Jesus isn't God in some way. I don't know, we're up there somewhere, but more to trying to break open the very traditional way we understand the Christmas story, or even since we just came through Lent and Good Friday and Holy Saturday and then Easter, so, which we didn't meet on Easter. I have to say that the traditional side of me went, oh my God, I'm not in church on Easter. Like, but very intentional about that, and then left it with the ways in which Jesus is still being crucified today, in our city, with mass incarceration, with so many things. That yes, we can celebrate the ways in which we see resurrection, but I think we so quickly move to Easter, or so to stay in the ways in which Jesus is being crucified today, hopefully moves us to action, that we would be people of resurrection, literally. Yes.
In terms of advice for a church that looks like this, I think skin tone and gender and all kinds of things. I mean, I value this church so much. I do think it grounds me. God is revealed in Jesus, a Jesus who wasn't trying to start a church. People worship him there to go to heaven someday, but really to work for a community, a healthy whole community. But one thing I like about Open Table is somehow it attracted people who all look very different from each other. We saw a woman with purple hair about my age, or maybe not quite that old, but we have young and old and in between, and David shows it up off the streets, some other people show up off the streets, and I don't, I think some of us are hungry, to have touches with people who don't look and seem just like us. And I don't know, I'm not saying that they would want to come to our worship. It's powerful to me, but it might not be right for them. But how do we get touches and build connection for folks, even within a faith community that is a lot like this one?
I'm gonna go back to listening, right? So we do a lot of listening, and like, what is the thing that people are asking questions about? So this church, this faith community can do that too. Like, what is the thing that folks are having conversations about? So the buzzword for us is around, okay, I left whatever tradition, church I grew up in, blah, blah, blah. But what is it that I actually believe? Do I even believe? What is it? So that's why we did this thing on why all these things. And then the one before that was, I'm trying to think. It blurs for me. We did on, like, what was the one before that? Ooh. Because we meet only the second and fourth Sundays, series go on for a while, so trying to think. But and then we did on liberation theology and saints, because we have some folks that are coming from a Catholic background. So what are ways that we can still hold up modern saints or ancient ones, to say, like, you don't have to be these, like, people from many, many centuries ago. Like, my saint that I did was Mr. Rogers. The ways in which, like, very typical, normal, kind of quirky man can still be a saint for today, so that we can see ourselves as people who can be influential in the world.
From a variety of religious traditions?
Yes. So we just did the panel, and it was interesting, right? Like, I had to hold my judgments, not bad or good, they just came in my head. But, like, we had folks that said very traditional backgrounds and still are there. And then folks that are, like, who would consider themselves like a Christian witch. And so, like, hearing people's stories around that, well, I may not hold that. Like, okay, tell me how you arrived there. To be open to that story and to realize the thing that came out for me is not that I believe those things, but to say we're all searching for something. We're all searching for what I think is the divine. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I love about the Monday night classes, because we talk about a variety of topics and get introduced to a variety of concepts, and we discuss all of it. And so, but I think you're absolutely right. You've got to be open to the discussion.
So often in church when you hear something, there's that subtext of, I'm supposed to agree or disagree with this. And to be in a church community of faith setting that's like, oh, I can just listen first. It's transformative.
And then deeper conversations happen as we're cleaning up, as we are cooking food. They're like, oh, I heard the speaker, or you said this. Can you tell me more about that? And that way, like, conversations happen. Yeah. And then it's interesting because I never know, and I guess this is true in traditional churches too, you never know the thing that's like people are thinking about from what you've said or what somebody said until you hear conversations later. And I'm like, huh, okay, yeah. So.
We have had such a blast listening to you, Letiah.
Yeah.
So can we give her another little round of applause? And I'm curious to see what will be bubbling up. I know I'm going to be talking about this at dinner with Mitch tonight, who's very curious about Whole New World, too. But I'm super excited. We're going to continue this conversation next week. The Reverends Shanna Stites and Suzanne Motter, who are both kind of on staff at Community Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ Church on the plaza right down the street. They are undergoing this exciting growth moment. Park Hill Christian Church is a disciples church in the Northland that through conversation is kind of not merging, growing together with Community Christian Church. So the reductive way of saying it is that they're going to become a satellite of Community Church. It's a lot more dynamic than that. But these two churches, they both have their own histories. Community is 130 years old. Not sure how old Park Hill is. But these two churches are coming into a new relationship with each other, and instead of doing the more capitalist-y satellite church model, trying to do this multi-site model in a way that's very, just a different ethos that matches wholeness more than a lot of the mega churches in the world. So super excited. Shanna Stites is the senior minister at Community, and Suzanne has been an associate along with her husband at Community for years, but she's kind of the transitional pastor based at Park Hill now. And so they're going to come and share, they're good friends with the congregation as well, about how these two churches are finding new ways to be in relationship with each other and God in this changing world. And then our last week, Jose Martinez is a local Kansas City disciple that works with the denomination for new and transforming churches. You may have seen him on Easter Sunday because he was here. He was here on Christmas. He comes to Country Club on a semi-regular basis, maybe 1.5 times a month, honestly. But works across the denomination with the new churches and churches kind of like Park Hill up north who are like, we need to do something totally different in order to continue surviving and thriving. And so kind of be keeping growing out from this neighborhood to the city to the country and beyond. So I'm super excited. It is a gift to be doing this whole new world and faith in all the wholeness and newness together with each of you, especially you tonight, Letiah. So thank you again, and I hope to see you all next week.
Yay.